Okay, hello, greetings. I'm Dr. Constantinos Yiallourides. First of all, I want to express my deep gratitude to ERPIC and George Belayas for this kind invitation and the opportunity to contribute. I've been asked to say a few words about the interplay between maritime delimitation and cooperative seabed energy arrangements in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, and I'm of course delighted to do so. Previous ERPIC presentations and publications have highlighted the plenitude of legal and geopolitical aspects of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea and its disputes, which have a long history and complex socio-economic dimensions. It is clear that the offshore areas of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea have received increasing attention with recent discoveries of large volumes of hydrocarbon resources, particularly of natural gas, which have confirmed earlier prospects. It is also clear that the Eastern Mediterranean Sea remains one of the most geographically and geopolitically complex seas in the world. It features multiple long-standing and competing territorial and maritime jurisdictional disputes among the coastal states of the region. There are various maps circulating on the internet, on various sites showing claims and counterclaims, disputed waters, petroleum licensing blocks, and areas of overlap. My preference is not to show any of those maps because A, those maps are often highly contentious or even inaccurate, and B, they are inevitably subject to change as states' positions and claims are also subject to change. What I will show you is the United Nations map of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, or indeed the whole Mediterranean Sea. What this map shows you is that the east part of the Mediterranean Sea is a semi-enclosed sea, is surrounded by 8 states or entities: Turkey in the north, Cyprus in the northeast, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine in the east, Egypt and Libya in the south, and of course the Aegean lies in the northwest. This is the geographic reality that we have on the ground as understood by the United Nations. Now, given the semi-enclosed nature of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, the existence of many states with coastal fronts, and the overall coastal geography of the region, the maritime claims of those coastal states or their maritime entitlements under international law inevitably tend to converge and overlap. And that leads to disputes over boundaries, the precise location of their maritime boundaries, and the underlying seabed resources. Past commentators have argued that these disputes, the disputes concerning the delimitation of the maritime boundaries and access to seabed energy resources, is seemingly fueled by the presence of those resources. So the presence or the suspected presence of rich seabed energy resources, past commentators have argued that has fueled disputes over boundaries. And it makes sense because neighboring countries seek to safeguard their access to those resources, taking steps to regulate seabed activities within their claimed maritime zones by designating offshore blocks for hydrocarbon exploration and exploitation. Now, about half of the oil blocks or other licensing areas in the Mediterranean Sea are classified as contentious due to uncertainties regarding the precise location of the relevant international maritime boundaries. And in light of this, the European Union has on multiple occasions stressed the importance of establishing maritime boundaries in the Mediterranean Sea. This process is, according to the EU, an important first step to facilitate not just peace and stability in the region, but also to address the overall governance problems, including energy exploration, fishing, prevention of marine pollution, but also offshore renewable energy development. The United Nations Security Council, third states such as notably France and the United States have also repeatedly called upon Eastern Mediterranean states to resolve their maritime disputes peacefully and to pursue their maritime claims only in accordance with international law, including the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. In other words, the underlying assumption is that you must reach agreement on boundaries in order to enable the peaceful resolution of the energy disputes as well, or to enable the peaceful resource exploration and exploitation, which will be unclouded by any legal or jurisdictional uncertainties. Therefore, despite the notorious reputation of resources, in particular energy resources, to create conflicts, the presence or prospect of such resources may also have a more positive reflection, that is, to prompt states to come together bilaterally or multilaterally through regional diplomatic efforts to conclude the necessary agreements as a means of clarifying jurisdictional claims and establishing clear boundaries, and thus a stable and secure environment for investment, one that enables the uninterrupted conduct of seabed energy activities. As the saying goes, good boundaries make good friends. So you need those boundaries to allow the resource exploration and exploitation activities to proceed uninterrupted without any legal or jurisdictional issues. And indeed, several maritime boundary delimitation agreements have already been concluded in the region. These include the Cyprus-Egypt agreement, the Cyprus-Lebanon agreement, the Cyprus-Israel agreement, the Turkey-Libya MOU on maritime delimitation, the Greece-Egypt agreement, and the Lebanon-Israel agreement. Now, this shows that the majority of the Eastern Mediterranean states have made progress in recent years to resolve outstanding maritime boundary delimitation issues. What is very important to keep in mind, however, and this is indeed the focus of my presentation today, is that delimiting an international maritime boundary, that is deciding on the precise location of a maritime boundary, while does contribute to legal certainty and a more stable offshore energy investment regime, does not in itself resolve all resource management issues. That is, delimiting Eastern Mediterranean maritime boundary dispute is not in itself enough to effectively manage the region's seabed energy resources. And that is based on the simple geological reality that hydrocarbon deposits do not conform to property lines at sea, to licensing demarcations or international maritime boundaries. So it's quite often, especially in semi-enclosed marine environments like the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, that once the boundary is delimited, offshore oil and gas resources or deposits may be discovered on either side of the boundary in a way that they are exploitable by either of the two countries on either side of the boundary. And that means that interstate cooperation and coordination is required even after reaching agreement on the boundaries. So indeed, and this is also based on industry and also state practice, after boundary delimitation, states and their respective license holders on either side of the boundary may have to agree on cooperative agreements and arrangements to maximize economic benefits accruing from seabed resources which straddle their maritime jurisdictions. So if straddling or transboundary hydrocarbon deposits are discovered after the delimitation of the boundary, it would be still crucial for states to agree on the applicable rules to develop the transboundary resources in an economically efficient and, of course, ecologically sound manner and according to best industry and engineering practice. Now, when we refer to straddling or transboundary hydrocarbon resources, we're essentially referring to those sub-seabed reservoirs which extend across an international maritime boundary in a way that can be exploitable from either side of the agreed boundary line. Therefore, those interstate cooperative regimes seek to develop the straddling or transboundary resource in an integrated manner as a single unit to ensure its safe and efficient exploitation. And this practice, again, is based on widely accepted industry practices, commonly known as unitization. And in the context of transboundary unitization, we're essentially referring, again, to treating a transboundary resource as a unit, and as a unit in the sense that the respective license holders on either side of the boundary come together in a type of joint venture with respect to parts of a single and continuous hydrocarbon reservoir that extends across the boundary of an agreed boundary line. And why we choose to do that? There are, of course, technical and environmental reasons for pursuing joint unitized operations over straddling hydrocarbon deposits. First of all, if you don't proceed with a coordinated plan, if you don't treat the deposit as a unit, that would lead to uncoordinated or worse, competing activities, including competing drilling, which poses significant risks, not just to the exploitability of the resource, not just to making the most out of the deposit itself, but also to the environment, to the marine environment as well. So costly or defensive or competing drilling, that is drilling that is motivated by the wish to prevent hydrocarbons from migrating from one side of the boundary to the other, could be harmful to the resource itself, but also to the marine environment more broadly. And again, this is especially true in semi-enclosed maritime environments. Any uncoordinated or even competing hydrocarbon exploration over transboundary resources may lead to pollution incidents. And as you probably know, any pollution incident in the Mediterranean would have catastrophic effects, both on the marine environment itself, but also on the coastal communities across the region, which depend on the region's maritime resources and tourism for their survival, for their economic survival. Now, beyond these technical and engineering and good industry practices, there is also international law. International law, as crystallized in the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, but also in customary international law, requires that states bordering a semi-enclosed sea, and that applies to the Mediterranean, should cooperate and should make every effort to coordinate their activities for the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And as part of this cooperation duty, there is also a requirement, an associated requirement, to collaborate and coordinate activities, including seabed activities across boundaries, as an indispensable element to environmental protection. Now, looking at state practice in the Mediterranean Sea, we can see that to date, all agreements concluded in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, that is Cyprus, Egypt, Cyprus, Lebanon, Cyprus, Israel, Turkey, Libya, and Greece, Egypt, and most recently Lebanon, Israel, All of these agreements emphasize the importance of international law and the law of the sea to achieve stability of boundaries, but also to promote resource collaboration across the boundaries. All of those agreements provide for a procedure to be followed in the event of a discovery of a single geological deposit extending from the maritime jurisdictional zone of one party to the maritime jurisdictional zone of the other. And there is a standard straddling deposit clause, which is contained in slight variations, but nevertheless, there is one of those clauses in each of those agreements. And that clause provides that if there are any natural resources, particularly hydrocarbon reservoirs, extending from the maritime zone of one party to the maritime zone of the other, then the parties should cooperate in order to reach an agreement on the modalities of the exploitation of such resources, and in order to reach a framework unitization agreement or the joint development and exploitation of the transboundary resource. Now, that clause, again, in various variations or in different variations, which is contained in all those agreements, mandates on each party to the agreement to cooperate with each other in order to reach additional agreements in the event of discovery of transboundary hydrocarbon resources. And this clause mirrors exactly what I mentioned earlier, the requirement under international law to seek collaboration on the development of seabed resources among neighboring states. Such clauses, that is straddling deposit or transboundary deposit clauses, can be found in the majority of maritime boundary treaties concluded to date. So it is an element of international state practice, but it is also an element of best industry practice. Now, an excellent example of states moving ahead with additional agreements in the event of discovering of hydrocarbon resources that extend across the boundaries, across their determined boundaries, is the framework agreement between Cyprus and Egypt, signed in 2013, relating to the development of cross-median line hydrocarbon resources. The Cyprus-Egypt Framework Agreement establishes procedures dealing with hydrocarbon resources which straddle or are suspected to straddle the exclusive economic zone boundary between the two states. Now, this framework agreement does not in itself constitute unitization. It's not, technically speaking, an agreement treating all straddling reservoirs as a single unit. However, it is a framework agreement which contemplates or provides that the two states will ask their respective license holders on either side of the boundary to negotiate on unitization agreements should there is indeed a transboundary hydrocarbon reservoir. So where a hydrocarbon reservoir straddles the Cyprus-Egypt boundary line, license holders operating on either side of the boundary will be asked by their respective governments to come together and negotiate a commercial agreement determining the contents of treating or how to treat the transboundary deposit as a unit. So this is essentially a unitization agreement, but it is a private sector commercial unitization agreement. Such unitization agreement would include, among other things, the exact geographical extent of the straddling deposit, the apportionment of reserves, subject to the final approval of the government of the two states. Now, note that there is a more recently concluded agreement, boundary agreement, that between Lebanon and Israel, an agreement that was mediated by the United States. And that boundary agreement includes a very similar straddling deposit clause. Under this agreement, the Lebanon-Israel agreement, if transboundary deposits are discovered across the boundary of the two states, the parties agree, first, not to take any unilateral action over the transboundary resource, and second, to notify the United States so it can facilitate through negotiations and additional consultations the necessary arrangements for the most effective exploration and exploitation of the transboundary resources. So if, for example, an Israeli appointed company drills a well on the Israeli side of the maritime boundary and discovers that that deposit may well be transboundary, that is, may well tap on seabed resources flowing from the Lebanese side of the boundary to the Israeli side of the boundary, then Israel is under an obligation to share this information with the United States and engage in additional discussions with Israel, so with Lebanon, to facilitate the coordinated development and exploitation of the transboundary resources. And again, in this scenario, the unitization agreement, which will be concluded, will be a private sector initiative, it will be a commercial agreement negotiated and signed between the companies operating on either side of the boundary. Now, this provision, the unitization of the transboundary agreement clause contained in the Israeli-Lebanon boundary, is consistent with regional state practice in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea and general international law. There is a requirement under international law that states should cooperate and should not act unilaterally when it comes to the exploitation of shared deposits. States, the expectation under international law is that states should negotiate the matter with each other in good faith with a view to concluding a cooperative agreement with respect to the transboundary resources. So in conclusion, regional state practice in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea suggests that transboundary exploitation, transboundary arrangements over the exploitation of resources that extend across the agreed boundaries constitutes the optimum course of action to bring about the equitable solution or the equitable exploitation of resources when such resources are found to straddle or are suspected to straddle the maritime boundary of two states. Such straddling deposit provisions within all existing delimitation agreements in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea indicate a very strong regional determination, a very strong belief that there should be no race to the bottom when such deposits are discovered. Several Eastern Mediterranean states have already assumed a treaty-based duty to conduct negotiations in good faith and to facilitate the cooperative exploitation of such straddling resources. So if you are interested in this area, please feel free to check out these publications as well. So at this point, I would like to thank you for your attention, and many thanks again to George Pelagias and ERPIC for the opportunity to contribute. Thank you and goodbye.